All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, tovos, Stephen Teri Czinn for dedicating over Shir Midrashos this month in honor of the birth of their granddaughter Devorah Eliana Czinn and Leib Nishmas, Dr. Zinn's father, Bunim Tzvi Ben Chaim, Shmuel Robyn Korobkin for dedicating over Shir Midrashos this month and the zechus refuah sheleima for Rabbi's cousin serving in the IDF, Benyamin Chaim Pesach ben Musha Chana, and creation of the Yahrzeit of Rabbi's mother, Pesa Mira Bas Chaim and Dr. Moshe and Gavant in memory of Dr. Gavant's parents, Shena Bas Abba, as well as Yakov, Meir ben Moshe, Leib, our week of learning sponsors, Judy Posner in memory of Shimshon Laser ben Moshe, Chaim ben Elioah Cohen, and Daniel Yehuda ben Shimshon Laser. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Ira Miriam Grossman in memory of Selma Wolf. May her memory always be for our blessings, and Mr. and Mrs. Stewie Shabbos and family, Lezecha Nishmas, their mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, Rivka Rezel Bas Yitzchak Zichron Lebrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need refuah, sheleima Cheshvan together with Kol Chol Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu Sheli Meretz Hashem, return our hostages b'shalom and b'karov, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful b'chol ma'asei yedehem. But so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, an incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Kuf Mem Beis 142, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Kuf Mem Aleph Amud Beis. Where did we leave off? Oh, fantastic. Okay, I'm not used to finishing the daf. This is great. Okay, excellent. We're actually starting on Kuf Mem Beis. Wonderful. So remember again, we are kind of picking up a little bit mid-topic, and remember again, the overarching topic that we are dealing with in yesterday's daf, and we'll continue into today's daf, and in Milton today, we will have resolution, is the ability for someone to go ahead and be makneh something to an Uber. Can you go ahead and convey ownership of something to a fetus in utero? That is the shayla. So remember again, it appears from all the other sources that the answer to that is an unequivocal no. Because remember again, even Rabbi Meir, who holds that Adam makneh davar shelo b'liolam, that you can convey ownership of something that does not yet exist, that is true as long as the recipient does exist. So the item you're conveying maybe doesn't have to exist, but the recipient absolutely must. But yet, so therefore, based on that, one would not be able to convey ownership to an Uber. On the flip side, our Mishnah clearly deals with a case where a father is conveying something to an Uber. Remember again, the case of the Mishnah was Reuven's married to Rachel, Rachel's pregnant, and Reuven says, Rachel, if you give birth to a girl, it's 200 zuz. If you give birth to a boy, it's 100 zuz. So clearly he's conveying ownership. He's conveying ownership to the Uber. So again, we're trying to work out halacha l'maisa, this contradiction, and ultimately, again, what halacha l'maisa is. So the Gemara, we're kind of picking up in the middle of it. So the Gemara says, let's go ahead and, so remember, Rav Huna was the opinion who said, Hamazake l'uber lo kana. Right, that was Rav Huna. So the Gemara says, remember, because Rav Huna was commenting one more point of reorientation. Rav Huna was commenting on the case that we saw towards the top of Kuf Mem Aleph Amud Beis. Hahuda Amar Ledvisu L'chasi Lahai Dim Avarta. I hereby convey my property to this child that you are pregnant with. So Rav Huna said, "Havim mizaka l'uber, mizaka l'uber lo kana." Fine. So the Gemara says, "V'lei malei the Amar l'chishatilid." Maybe Rav Huna is talking about a case where halacha l'maisa again. The situation is where the wife is giving birth. In other words, maybe he's saying, when you give birth, I'll go ahead and convey this property over. So the Gemara says, Rav Huna l'tamei dam Rav Huna af l'chishatilid lo kana. So Rabbi said this is very interesting. So Rav Huna is of the opinion that even that would not work. That would not work. So in other words, not only does it not work to convey ownership to an Uber, to the fetus in utero, but even more than that, it does not work to convey ownership even to the baby once it's born. In other words, to be able to say, when you give birth, I hereby convey ownership to this fetus. If you take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment, look at the Rashbam in the middle. It's the first Rashbam, but it's the last wide line. So we're picking up in the middle. So the Amar Rafuna, Af hamazake l'uber b'chiyai gavna d'amar l'chishateleid klomar nechasi l'haydin ma'abra l'chishiyulad lo kana. So this is interesting. So not only does Rav Huna say that you can't convey ownership to a fetus, right? That's understood. But he says like this. Let's say Reuven says to Rachel, when you give birth, right, I hereby convey 100 zuz to the baby once you give birth. So I would have thought that should work. Because remember again, you're conveying ownership ultimately again to, thank you, you're conveying ownership to a child once it's born. Rav Huna would say even in that case it doesn't work. Why? Look at the Rashbam says, Dechevan de b'shas hakna uberhu ve'eno yachal zechus lo yikne l'cheshiyulad ayede amira de amish tele. So interesting. So according to Rav Huna, essentially, in order for the uber, in order for the child, in order for the baby to be able to go ahead and acquire, so halacha l'maisa, the child has to be in existence at the time of the conveyance. In other words, at the time that the transaction is being formed, which essentially what Rav Huna is saying is like this. If you're going to have a conveyance from A to B, so A and B both have to be in existence at the time of the conveyance. Even if the actual conveyance is delayed until some later point, if both parties to the transaction are not in existence at the time the transaction is being forged, it doesn't work. Doesn't work. Okay? So the Gemara says, Dam Rav Huna af l'chishatele lo kana. So Rav Huna says, not only can you not convey ownership to an uber, but you can't create a transaction where the recipient doesn't exist at the time the transaction is being made, even if the transaction doesn't take place until the actual recipient is born. The Rav Nachman, hamazake l'uber lo kana. Rav Nachman holds, if you convey ownership to an uber, it doesn't work. L'chishatele kana. But ultimately, again, so this is machlokes Rav Nachman and Rav Huna. Right? So Rav Nachman says, although you cannot convey ownership to an uber, what you can do is you can convey ownership to the baby once it's born. I was well say, let me clarify this point. There's two different transactions over here. Right? Reuven is married to Rachel. So what happens? Rachel is pregnant. So everyone except our Mishnah, but everyone for our purposes right now holds that to convey ownership of something to the fetus doesn't work. The shaila is, can you convey ownership to the fetus once it's born, even though presently now the fetus is obviously a fetus, is in utero? So Rav Huna says no, as we're going to see in just a moment. Rav Nachman says, yeah, you could do that. Because remember again, at the point of the conveyance, the recipient is in existence. Rav Huna on the other hand says, Rav Huna says that neither of these transactions works. Neither of these transactions work. You cannot convey ownership to a fetus, nor can you enter into a transaction with something that doesn't exist at the time of the transaction, even though the chalos, the actualization of the transaction, will not take place until the recipient does exist. Okay? Rav Shesha says, so we'll say on the flip side, okay, so now, Baruch Hashem, so now we have our spectrum of opinions. Rav Shesha says, it all works. It all works. You could be mizakeh to an uber. You could have a delayed transaction to the birth of the baby. All of it ultimately works. So we'll say, so here we are. So let's pause here for just a moment, because this is one of these perfect moments in life where everything, the universe is in absolute alignment. Now I know, finally, the spectrum of opinions. So remember again, let's kind of work backwards. We have Rav Sheshas. Rav Sheshas is one extreme. Rav Sheshas says, in order for you to enter into a transaction with another party, that party has to be in existence at the time the actual transaction is made. It doesn't make a difference, even if the transaction is not going to drop. Even if it's not going to actualize until some later date. If you don't have two actual living parties to a transaction, you cannot enter into it. So therefore, again, not only can you not convey ownership to an uber, but you can't convey ownership to a child who will exist in the future, even though the transaction won't be chal until the future. That's Rav Sheshas, right? Then again, after Rav Sheshas, he got to Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says you can't convey ownership to an uber, but you can convey ownership to a child who will exist in the future, as long as the transaction doesn't actualize until the birth of that child. And then again, the most extreme you have is Rav Sheshas. Rav Sheshas says it all works. It all works. You could be mizakeh to an uber, and once you could be mizakeh to an uber, then what? You could do anything, right? In other words, once you hold that essentially, and this would seem to be also based on an extreme interpretation of Rabbi Meir, of Adam Matne Davar Shalom Bali Olam. So once you hold that you could be mizaket to an uber, then pretty much you could enter into any type of transaction. Okay. Amar Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says, Mina Min Allah, how do I know that you can do this? Now again, remember, Rav Sheshes is saying you could be mizaket to an uber, and you could also be mizaket to a child to be born at a later time. I don't know you could do this. Tisanya, here we go. This is actually a fascinating case. Tisanya, ger shemes ubizbezu yisrael nechasav. This is actually fascinating. You have a ger who died. Now, we're assuming over here that the ger died without any relatives. Not any relatives. So now what happens? So what happens when a ger dies without relatives? His property becomes hefker. So now ger dies, no relatives. So other Jews come along and take his possessions. They're hefker. Fine. So what happened? It's fascinating. Vishamu sheyesh lo ben. After, so let's play this out. So Ger dies. So Reuven, Shimon, and Levi hear that Ger died, and as far as they knew that he never had any relatives. So what do? Others, rightfully so, they come and they take his property because it's hefker. Then what happens? After they took it, they heard, Ger had a son. He had a son. Or they heard that his wife was pregnant. So then what's the halacha? Chayav and lahachzir. Okay, so obviously in that case, they're obligated to go ahead and give back the property, because obviously it turns out that the ger has an inheritor. Take a look at the Rashban for just a moment. It's actually right across. If you just move to the right in about 4 lines, then chayav and lahachzir, kevan di ishto me'uberes, ubar yoresh havi, so we'll see, even before we go on, that's it. That's the point we're looking at over here. What's fascinating about this? So now Reuven and Shimon and Levi took the property thinking that it was hefker. They find out that the wife of the ger is pregnant. So what's the halacha? They have to return the property. Now, when do they have to return the property? When do they have to return it? Right now. In other words, they don't have to wait to return it until the baby's born. They have to return it now. What does that show you? That shows you that halacha l'maisa, an uber acquires. An uber acquires, because obviously, otherwise, if the uber didn't acquire, wait until the wife gives birth. No, they have to return it right now, because you see from here that the fetus does in fact acquire that Yerusha from his father. So now, watch this. The case, so it happens to be, for our purposes, that's the totality of what we wanted to get from this particular case. But it happens to go on. The Gemara says, Hechziru akol. So let's say again, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, they're good guys, right? They weren't doing anything malicious. They thought the property was hefker. Turns out the property was not hefker, so they return it. After they returned it, Hechziru v'achar kach shamu shemes beno oshe pilo ishto. Afterwards, after they return it, what do they hear? They hear that the son of the ger died, or that his wife miscarried. So therefore, it turns out that's what? No yoresh, right? There's no inheritor. Then what is actually interesting, the Gemara says, Hichzik b'shniya kana u'barishona lo kana. So what's the halacha? The halacha is, so they could acquire again. So now, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi have the ability, if they want, to reacquire the estate. But in order for them to reacquire the estate of the ger, they would have to make another kinyan. They would not be able to rely on the first kinyan which was made. Okay, so the Gemara says, I suggest as an aside, take a look. So that happens to be interesting by itself. Take a look at the Rashbam. Berishona lo kana degloi milsa shahaya lo ben o uber va'afagav the sof meis ha'uber bebetan v'lo yotzla avira olam ki yoresh kamer chashavlei umara lecheskas machzik erishona ama uber yoresh krav sheshes. So what do you see from here? So this is fascinating. So one more time. So ger dies. Right, as far as Reuven, Shimon, and Levi know, ger died without any inheritors. So therefore his property becomes hefker. They swoop in, not swooping in a bad way, but it's hefker. So they're coming along and they take it. It turns out they hear afterwards that what? Ger's wife is pregnant. So what's the halacha? Give it back. What do you see from there? That an uber does in fact inherit. Okay? Now part 2 of the case, it turns out that Ger's widow miscarries. So now there's no more yoresh. So what's the halacha? Reuven and Shimon and Levi. So we'll say, interestingly enough, if Reuven and Shimon and Levi want to acquire the property, what do they need to do? A second kinyan. Meaning what? They can't rely on the first kinyan that they made. Why not? Because since there was an uber, the uber inherited. the inheritance of the Uber essentially undermined the effectiveness of the first Kinyan, and therefore, again, now it's truly Hefker, there are no more Yarshim, there's no more inheritor, they could go and acquire the property again. But you see from here is that they would need to go ahead and make another Kinyan on the property. What does that show you? That shows you that, in fact, an Uber does acquire. So all of this is Rav Shesh's proof to his position that an Uber acquires, and of course, I will say, once you prove that an Uber is able to acquire something, then obviously it goes without saying that you could be mizakeh, you could go ahead and bequeath something to a Uber once it is born. That becomes an easy case. The Gemara says, here we go. And if you would think that an Uber doesn't acquire, then lama lohu achzuki b'shniya hachzika lechadazimna. Then I will say, if an Uber wouldn't acquire, then what? While I understand that once Reuven and Shimon Levi hear that Mrs. Ger is pregnant, so okay, I understand they're going to have to kind of give back the property. But once Mrs. Ger miscarries, then if an Uber was really never kana, then their first kinyan should be effective. They shouldn't have to do a second kinyan. The fact that they have to do a second kinyan indicates to us that the Uber did in fact acquire. Therefore, the first kinyan did not work. And therefore, if they want to acquire the property, they would have to do a second kinyan. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Rabbi, so Silber says, Silber, pause for just a moment. This is Rav Shesh's proof. This is his proof. So he says, you see from here that halacha l'maisa, an Uber is kona. Beautiful. That's it. So now the Gemara says, Rabbi, 1 second. Rabbi says, this is not necessarily a really good proof, right? That in general, that an Uber. So we'll say, so remember again. So based on this, what Rav Sheshes wants to say is the following: that let's say again, let's just apply this to a different case, right? Reuven is married to Rachel. Rachel's pregnant. Reuven says, I hereby want to give the fetus 200 zos. So Rav Sheshes says, it works. It works. The Uber acquires 200 zos. An Uber is kona based on this case. Tucha Abaye says, not necessarily. This case could be different. Why? Yerusha haba me'ele hashayni. And also, we've seen this already a couple of times throughout this sugya. Inheritance may be different. Now, why would inheritance be different? Because inheritance is something that comes to you de facto. There's a difference between inheritance and a different kind of conveyance. How so? We'll say in a typical case of conveyance, what do you have? You have a conveyor and a conveyee. Is that a word? Yeah, okay. Right, you have a conveyor, a giver. I could say it simpler. You have a giver and a recipient. Right? So there's someone driving the act of giving, and then there's a recipient. Yerusha is not like that. In Yerusha, there is no one who's driving the act of giving. In other words, that act occurs as a result of another act, namely death. So someone dies. Therefore, because someone dies, by definition, there's a Yerusha. So maybe we can say like this. If I want to suggest that maybe halacha l'maisa, the way it works is as follows. Maybe the way it works is like this: that when could an Uber acquire something? An Uber acquires in a case of Yerusha, because the case of Yerusha is something almost being foisted upon the Uber. He's not asking for it. No one's conveying it. Right? It's just being conveyed almost me'atzmo by itself. But maybe in a different kind of case of conveyance, it doesn't work. We've seen this a number of times before already. So Abaye just says maybe by Yerusha, even if you say that an Uber could acquire an inheritance, lav dafka, not to say that translates into an Uber being able to acquire other items. Okay, so Rava says, so Rava Amar, shiny hasam. Rava also wants to suggest that this case of the ger may also be a little bit different. How so? Dirafuye mirafinan biadaihu meikara. So Rava wants to say like this. Perhaps also the reason, now we'll say, the key proof to the fact that an Uber acquires in this case is the fact that after the death of the Uber, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi have to make a second kinyan. Right? In other words, if an Uber was never Konev, then their first kinyan should work. The fact that after Mrs. Ger miscarries, they have to make another kinyan indicates to us that the Uber disrupted their ownership. To which Rava said, maybe not. Maybe in the case, maybe what's flawed over here is, and the reason they have to make a second kinyan is not because the Uber acquired, but rather the following. When Reuven and Shimon and Levi swoop down, and swoop sounds negative, but you understand, they swoop in and they acquire the property of the ger. So we'll say, so remember again, what's in the back of their mind? What's going on in the back of their mind? So going back is that maybe there is an inheritor they don't know about. Maybe there is a relative, maybe there is a kid, maybe she is pregnant. See, at the moment of the first kinyan, so Rav wants to suggest that the kinyan itself is a shaky kinyan, right? Because in order for a kinyan to be absolute, the das has to be absolute. But in this case over here, they don't know Reuven. They just heard Reuven was a ger. They heard Reuven didn't have any offspring or he didn't have any inheritors. So they go in and they acquire. But in the back of their mind, they're thinking to themselves, but it's possible maybe new information will come to light. So Rava wants to suggest that perhaps that's why they need a second kinyan. After Mrs. Ger miscarries, and so it is clear that there is no line of inheritance, now it is clear that Reuven, Shimon, and Levi have the ability to make a bona fide kinyan. So the halacha obligates them to now make a second kinyan because the first kinyan was really a shaky one. But maybe it's not because that an uber acquires. So we'll say, so therefore again, interestingly enough, no one is disagreeing about the facts of this case. So halacha l'maisa, the way the case is going to work out is as follows. So again, ger dies. We hear without children. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi come along. They acquire the estate of the ger. They then hear that Mrs. Ger is pregnant. Okay, so now obviously if Mrs. Ger gives birth, so the child is going to inherit. If Mrs. Ger miscarries, so Reuven and Shimon and Levi have the ability to acquire the estate, but they require a second kinyan. What do you do with this case? According to Shesha, so Shesha says, this shows you what I've been saying the whole time, that an uber is kona. An uber is kona, had another uber is kona. The fact that Reuven and Shimon and Levi need to make another kinyan after Mrs. Ger miscarries indicates to us that the uber acquired while the uber was in existence. Okay, that's Rav Sheshas. Abaye and Rava say, first of all, number one, so Abaye agrees with Rav Sheshas, but he says, don't extrapolate from here that an uber could acquire in all cases. Maybe it's just by Yerusha, because Yerusha is not really a conveyance. Yerusha is simply, it's a de facto reality. In other words, there is a force beyond normative transactions that is pushing this property towards the Ober. Maybe it's Tafka. In that case, the Ober acquires, but not in a typical case of conveyance. Rava comes along and Rava says, hold up here. This has nothing to do with an Ober acquiring. This has the reason why Reuven, Shimon, and Levi need a second kinyan after Mrs. Ger miscarries is because their first kinyan was flawed. Their first kinyan was flawed. Or maybe flawed is the wrong word. Their first kinyan was weak. Now, why was it weak? Because at the moment that they acquired the property, what are they thinking in the back of their mind? As far as we know, there's no heir. But I don't know, maybe there is. Maybe there is. So in the back of their mind, they're already thinking to themselves that, you know what, maybe this is not completely ours. Therefore, once it becomes clear that there is no other heir, we say to them, okay, make another kinyan in order to solidify your ownership. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe now, what's the nafkamina between Abaye and Rava? Ikibinav sheshamu bo shemes. So both say, so again, what would be the nafkamina? The nafkamina would be in a situation where they heard definitively that, sheshamu bo shemes, velo mes v'achar kach mes. So the nafkamina would be in the following situation where they heard that the uber died, in other words, that Mrs. Ger miscarried, and ultimately again, but she didn't miscarry, but she did in fact miscarry later on. Right? So again, in other words, they heard it. They heard the uber passed away or miscarried. It didn't, and then later on it did. So, as I say, interestingly enough, according to Abaye, they would require another kinyan because the presence of the uber does acquire uber zoch, and therefore they would require another kinyan. According to Rava, since at the time they made their first kinyan, the news they had, although it turned out to be fake news, but the news that they had was that the uber wasn't alive. Therefore, their first kinyan was a bona fide kinyan. And even though it turns out that the uber was alive, but then died afterwards, so the Maisa again, the first kinyan was a bona fide kinyan. Therefore, there would be no need for a second kinyan. Okay, so we'll say. So again, just to highlight, what's our takeaway? Like, I have no idea, right? And so I'll tell you what our takeaway is. Now we know the three opinions involved in this discussion. This is exactly what we needed from the Gemara. So I understand there's Rav Sheshes, and Rav Sheshes is going to say you could be maknet to an uber, no problem, and therefore you could also be maknet to a child once it is born. You've got Rav Huna. Rav Huna says none of these cases work. According to Rav Huna, right? Rav Huna and Rav Sheshes are the poles in this. Rav Sheshes says an uber could acquire a child once it's born, could acquire future acquisition. On the other hand, again, Rav Huna is saying none of this works. In order for a transaction to be valid, the giver and the recipient must both be alive at the time of the transaction itself. And then you got Rav Nachman, the middle position, saying you can't convey to an uber, but you can create a transaction which is chal once the baby is born. So these are now our three opinions. So now, Baruch Hashem, now at least I understand that there's not a contradiction between the Mishnah, which says you can be mezaka to an uber, and all these other cases. There's just a three-way machlokas. So now I have three different opinions, three-way machlokas. Okay, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Tashma, Tinok ben yom echad, nochel umanchil. A baby that is 1 day old has the ability to inherit and to bequeath. So the Gemara says, ben yom echad in uberlo. What do you see from here? It's tafka, a baby who's 1 day old, who has the ability to inherit and bequeath, but not an uber. But not an uber. So the Gemara says, no. Nochel b'nichse ha'av lahanchil la'achad min ha'em. What he's talking about, Tovir say, is a specific case of, you're talking about paternal brothers. Paternal brothers who ultimately, again, obviously they're paternal brothers, not maternal brothers. So a baby who's 1 day old has the ability to acquire from his mother in order to bequeath it to his brothers. Right? So you could have, so remember again, inheritance is all paternal. Right? So paternal brothers are the ones who inherit each other. So you could have a situation of, let's say again, you have an only child from one mother, but again, he is a half-brother to his other brothers paternally, and Lemaisa, again, if he dies and he's the sole inheritor of his mother, let me say it differently. If he's the sole inheritor of his mother dies, he inherits his mother. If he dies, then technically speaking, his paternal brothers would inherit him, right? Assuming he has no other closer heirs. So that would be a situation of where, interestingly enough, an inheritance that a brother gets from his mother could be conveyed ultimately to his paternal brothers. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Nochel b'nichse av lahanchil la'achin min ha'av." Nochel b'nichse ha'em lahanchil la'achin min ha'av. So this is a case of a brother who inherits, a son who inherits from his mother, who then conveys ownership of that property later on, bequeaths that property to his paternal brothers. Now, both say, now that case, v'dafka ben yom echad. Now, the only way for a son, listen to this, the only way for a son to inherit his mother is how? If the son was born. If the son was born, right? So it has to be, in order for the son to inherit his mother, the son has to be at least a day old. In other words, the son has to be birthed. Aval uber lo. An uber can't inherit his mother. See, I just want to point out something very interesting over here. You might have thought like this. Maybe if you hold that an uber could acquire, right, then maybe like this. Maybe if you have Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, right, are the sons of Yakov. Right? They're the sons of Yakov from Leah. Yakov has another wife, Rachel, right? Rachel, and now what happens? Rachel is pregnant. Let's say Rachel passes away. If Uber is Zocha, if an Uber could acquire, then maybe Rachel dies. The Uber then inherits her, even in utero. Uber dies, and now therefore Reuven and Shimon and Levi should inherit Uber. To which the Gemara says that doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? My taima, Amud Beis, for a very practical reason. My taima, dehu mayis bereisha. Because ultimately, again, the Uber dies before the mother. The Uber dies before the mother. Now, this is again, the Gemara understanding over here, that Rashbam points out that I was here talking about a situation of death from natural cause. Right? That when a mother dies from natural causes, her fetus dies before she does. So because, and this is fascinating, so because the fetus dies first, therefore the Uber does not inherit the mother. See, I will say, fascinatingly enough, if you hold that an Uber is able to inherit, then you could have a situation of an Uber who inherits his mother in utero. The mother dies, the Uber inherits, and then the paternal brothers would inherit the Uber. It's fascinating. The Gemara says, but here's why that doesn't happen, because in a case of death of natural causes, the Uber dies before the mother. The Uber dies before the mother, and therefore again, ve'en haben yoresh es imo bekever lahanchil acha min ha'av. And I will say again, halacha l'maisa. So a child cannot posthumously inherit his mother in order to convey ownership to his paternal brothers. In other words, the way inheritance works, Rabbi will say, is that inheritance only works if the inheritor is alive. Now, remember, what we did see with the laws of inheritance is that your inheritors inherit your inheritance position, Right? So in other words, so technically speaking, you do inherit a little bit posthumously. In other words, your position inherits even when you're no longer here because your heirs take on your inheritance position. But a child can't posthumously inherit his parents. So if the uber is dead, right, if the uber is no longer alive, the uber can't inherit the mother so as to pass on that inheritance to its paternal brothers. So again, it's actually a really fascinating case. So halacha l'maisa, because the Gemara's understanding over here is that an uber dies before the mother in a case of a natural death, so therefore again the uber never inherits the mother because the uber is already dead at the time that the mother dies in order to convey ownership to the paternal brothers. Okay, so the Gemara says, one second. L'meimra, duhu mayis bereisha. Is that true? That an uber dies before the mother? That if the mother dies of natural cause, right, pregnant mother dies, that the fetus dies before the mother dies? So the Gemara says, V'ha hava ovda. We've seen this happen, unfortunately. Again, cases like this happen. Upir case tlasa pirkuse. Now, the Gemara over here is referring to a very specific event, right? The Gemara is not talking about a theoretics over here. The Gemara is saying we saw this once happen, right? There was a case like this where Nebuch, the mother, was pregnant. Then the mother died. No, she was pregnant. She died, and the baby was still kicking even after the mother died. The baby the fetus was moving around in utero even once the mother died. To which the Gemara says that's not a raya. Amar Mar Baravashi. Midi dehava azonav halta shemifar cheses. So we'll say it's actually interesting. So remember again, movement after death is not a sign of life. Right? Movement after death is not a sign of life. There's sometimes, again, there are certain, I don't know what the technical scientific term, but certain, physical spasms that occur. Right? This is like the famous, right? If you ever see shchita, right, you'll see many times, right? Look, literally, you take off the head of the chicken, right, and lemaisa, the chicken is running around. So clearly, the chicken is dead. The chicken is dead, right? It doesn't just need a refuah sheleima, right? It's done, right? But lemaisa, so you see from here, physical movement, that spasmodic movement after death, is not indicative of life. So lemaisa, again, the Gemara says, it gives the example of apparently, if you cut off the tail of a lizard, so apparently the tail wags around even when it is detached from the lizard. So that shows that there could be certain posthumous spasmodic movement that is not at all indicative of life. So therefore, again, even in utero, the fact that the baby is kicking, the fetus is kicking after the death of the mother, in no way indicates that it is alive. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. Ma'abrei Rav Yosef mishmei Rav Amar l'shememait bechilek bechora. So what does it mean ultimately again? So what does it mean that halacha l'maisa again, when it says tinok ben yom echa nochel umanchil, what does that mean that a baby that's 1 day old has the ability to inherit and bequeath? So the Gemara Samari Rav Yosef Mishmei Rava says shamat bechilek bechora. The existence of this baby 1 day old has an implication and an impact on the double portion of the bechar. In other words, that this baby, I just want to point out something very interesting, that in halacha, so a baby at different intervals has different halachic designations at different times. For example, we saw this, remember again, in last cycle in Moed Katan. No, this cycle Moed Katan. So remember again, we saw that if a baby dies within 30 days, according to many opinions, there's no shiva. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, within 30 days, there's a lack of viability. So it's interesting to see that a newborn, literally a day-old baby, has different ramifications for different areas of halacha. So, right, in Hilchos Avelos, it's not considered to be a viable life, and therefore the laws of Avelos don't apply. Yet, what Ma'abar Yosef says is, a baby once it's born, even day-old baby, is considered to be viable out Yerusha purposes. So, for example, that baby will have an implication for the firstborn's double portion. Well, so remember how we divide up, how we decide Pishnaim, how Pishnaim works? You take the number of brothers, right? Add plus one. Add one to the actual number of brothers. Divide the estate by that number. I don't know why it's going like that, right? And the Bechar takes 2. So, for example, if there are 4 brothers, let's just do Reuven, Shimon, Leib. If there are 3 brothers, so the way we do it is we divide the estate divided by 4, and the firstborn takes 2 of those portions. So, Ma'abrei Rav Ashi says like this. He says, once there is a baby that is 1 day old, he counts for Bechorah. right? In other words, he will have an implication for how you're dividing up the estate out the Bechor. Aval uber lo, but not by an uber. So both say, right? So in other words, if father dies, right? If father Yakov dies, and there's Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, right? And Yakov's wife is pregnant, that uber does not have an implication out the Bechorah. Okay? So the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? The Yoldu lo Amrachmana. So Rabbi say, so the Gemara says, because when it comes to the Bechar's first portion, the Torah used lashon of the Yoldu lo Bunim. So who's part of the calculation of the firstborn's portion? Who's part of that? Only children who are born. So I will say, I just want to point out what's fascinating over here is you begin to see that there are like many competing principles. So in other words, even if you hold that an uber acquires inheritance, it could very well be that when it comes to the calculation of the firstborn's double portion, an uber is not involved. He's not counted over here. And again, why? Separate Rasha. Because when it comes to Bechar, the lashon of the Torah is v'yoldulo. And the father has sons. They were born to him sons, which indicates to us only living birthed children come into play when calculating out the firstborn's portion. The Amar Ma'abrei Rav Yosef Mishmei de Rabba Ben Shenolad Achar Misas Aviv Eino Memait Bechelek Bechora. Interesting. So Ma'abrei Rav Yosef said the name of Rabba that a son who is born after the death of his father does not calculate into the calculation of the estate for the firstborn's portion. Right? Why is that? My time. Simple. We'll say it's a drasha. It's a drasha. Again, by the way, the context, just so you should know, the context is, this is Parshas Kiseitze, right? Right after. Also remember again, the way the section of firstborn portion is written is Yifas Toar, right? Kiseitze L'Milchama, war bride, and then the section of you'll marry two women, one who you will love, one who you don't love, and the Bechar, or not like, right? And the Bechar ultimately again is for the first wife who you don't have the warmest feelings towards, right? And then the Torah says, "Lo yuchal levaker," you can't favor the younger son over the older son. That's the context. So the lashon of the pasuk is the yodulo banim hahuva vasnua. So you'll have sons to the wife you love, to the wife you don't love. V'haya habein habachar l'snia, and the bachar ultimately again will be the firstborn son of the wife who you don't have the close relationship with. So then the Torah says you can't favor the younger son over the older son. So the Gemara is discussing over here that if you notice, when it comes to discussion about firstborn rights, the lashon is v'yoldulo. It's all about birthed children and nothing to do with fetuses. Fascinating. Besura masnuachi. So in Surah they had this version. Bepombadisa masnuachi. And Pombadisa had a different version. Armad Rav Yosef Mishmei de Rabba. Bechar shenolad la'achar misas adev eno notel pishnayim. So I'll say this is actually another implication of this. Right? Reuven is married to Rachel. Rachel's pregnant with their first child. Reuven dies. So now, and let's say again, for whatever, let's say Reuven has other children, or he has daughters, right? So now what happens? So now this child is born. A child born after the death of his father doesn't have the status of Bechar. Okay. So the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Yakir Abrahmana Vahal Lesa. So I will say, so this is interesting. V'ha lesa di yakir. So what I say, interestingly enough, because the Torah uses lashon of yakir. Yakir means the father is literally kias ben abachar ben asnua yakir. It's the next pasuk that follows one we just stated before. The father has to recognize the rightful bachar. Now, what does it take to recognize someone? They have to be in existence. So if the bachar is not born at the time of the death of the father, he doesn't have the halachic status of bachar. V'ha lesa di yakir. And the Gemara says, "V'hilchasa kechol hani lishna d'ar ma'abrei Rav Yosef mishmei de Rabba." And we'll say that halacha follows all of these statements that we just made in the name of Ma'abrei Rav Yosef, in the name of Rabbi. We'll see that halacha nice in just a little bit. On Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rabbi Yochanan, hamazaki le'uber lo kana. All right, so now we're circling back because this is still the raging issue. So Rabbi Yitzchak says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, if you convey ownership of something to an uber, the uber does not acquire. Vim Torah Mishnah Seinu. So we'll say, what about the Mishnah? We keep, and remember, the whole problem with this is, remember our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said, Omer im teled ishti zachar yital mana, yolda zachar yital mana. Right? Reuben's married to Rachel. Rachel's pregnant, and if Reuben says, if you give birth to a boy, I'm conveying to the boy a mana, the halacha is the baby acquires it. The fetus acquires it. So here, Rav Yitzchak Bar Rabbi Yochanan says, if you convey ownership to an uber, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You'll say, what about our Mishnah? No, don't bring her out from the Mishnah. Hoil v'daito shel adam krova eitzel beno. All right, so we'll say, so now, this is quite fascinating. Perhaps our Mishnah is different. Why is our Mishnah different? Because halacha l'maisa, a person is close to his son. A person is close to his son. A person has a certain level of closeness to his son. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. It's in the wide lines, 2, 4, 6, 7 lines into the widest lines. Krova eitzel beno, v'gamar umakne b'chol libo, avalu uber lo kana. So we'll say, so this is incredible. This is incredible. So we'll say, so apparently, the idea is like this. Why is it that you can't be makna to an uber? Right? Why is it? So we'll say, on the most basic level, it's because a transaction requires two parties. And in general, in order for a kinyan to be chal, I have to know who I am conveying to. If there is not a clear conveyance destination, right? So then there's no transaction. There's no transaction. So what the Gemara is suggesting over here is something quite fascinating. So therefore, in general, if I don't know where the destination of the conveyance is, I'm not fully vested in the kinyan. Which makes sense, right? In other words, for me to give something over to, for me to give something over to B, I'm A, to give something over to B, I have to know who B is, what B is, what am I conveying over to? And if it's amorphous or ambiguous, then the act of conveyance is amorphous and ambiguous, and therefore, again, is not fully chal. On the other hand, the Gemara says there's one exception to this. What's the exception? Your child. Your child. A parent, right? So the father, even though his child is in utero, so who's your kid? I don't know. Is it a boy or a girl? I don't know. Right? Tzaddik or Rasha? I don't know. Gibor or Chalosh? Like the Gemara says, I don't know. Chacham or Tipesh? I don't know. I don't know anything. What do I know? It's my kid. It's my kid. And there is a closeness to that child, even though there is absolute, profound, and overwhelming familial ambiguity. I don't know anything about this kid. I don't know what it's going to be, who it's going to be. I don't know anything, but it's mine. And because it's mine, therefore, by definition, there's a closeness. And that closeness is what allows the transaction to occur. I would say, is that not absolutely beautifully, both halachically and ashkafically overwhelming? So in other words, Sigmar is suggesting like this. Even if you hold that in general, hamezake uber doesn't work. You're right. So if I try to convey to someone else's fetus, I don't know, I'm just in a fetus-giving mood, right? So I just want to be mezake to ubrim all over, right? So again, that doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because transactionally, for you to commit to a transaction, you have to know the destination of the transaction, the destination of the conveyance. And if there's any level of ambiguity in it, the transaction doesn't work. There's only one area of ambiguity, of transactional ambiguity, that works, and that's with your own child. There is a closeness to that uber, even though, again, there is absolute fundamental identity ambiguity surrounding that uber. Adam, a person is karov to his child. Adam krova eitzel beno. Therefore, what? I'm willing to give to that uber, even though, again, there is complete ambiguity from a destinational perspective. I would say, is that not incredible? So again, so what's happening over here is Rabbi Tzvi has introduced to us, now this is a new shita. So this is saying, in general, I could accept, you cannot be mezakeh to an uber. I could accept that. Yet, the Mishnah is not a contradiction. Why? Because whose uber is it? It's my uber. It's my uber. And to my fetus, to my child, that even though, again, there is some level of transactional ambiguity, I still fully and wholly commit to the transaction. And therefore it works. Incredible. I will say, just so you appreciate this for the full profundity that it is, it gives you a new understanding, a new appreciation when the pasuk says, Bunim atem la'Hashem Elokeichem. What does it mean when the Torah calls us sons of the Ribono Shel Olam? I will say, if you think about it, a lot of us are still in utero. What do I mean by that? So I'll say, we have not really actualized. We're not really actualized. We're playing around. We're just kind of swimming around, moving around, a little bit aimless, a little bit directionless, kind of acting at least a little bit helpless, not really taking the reins of life, not really becoming the people we need to become. But what's incredible? But yet a father showers bracha upon his kid, even though the kid is not self-actualized. Even though the child may be a little bit lost, right, in that amniotic sac of the human condition, right? And even though, again, I'm not really taking the reins of my life and not really becoming the person I need to become, a father still feels so close to a child that he just wants to give him bracha. Sometimes we walk around in life. It's important every once in a while to have one of these moments where you take stock of your brachas. And if you take stock of your brachas, and I think at least a lot of times, I arrive at a fundamental question, which is, why me? Everybody's used to asking why me when bad things happen. It's very important to ask why me when you take stock of your brachas. Because I would venture to say, 9.9 out of 10 times when I look at the brachas I have in life, when we look at the brachas we have in life, I don't deserve that. I don't deserve it. There's nothing I per se deserve. So if I don't deserve it, why do I have it? This Gemara. Because hoil v'dait shel adam krova eitzel beno. If a father, human father, feels so close to his fetus child, even though he doesn't know him, to engage in transactional certainty and to convey to him beautiful bracha, alachas kama v'kama avinu sh'mashen chadish baruch hu. Even though, again, you're right, I'm not, again, I will say, it's important to own it. I'm not living the life I need to live. I'm not the person I need to be. I haven't self-actualized in the way that I have to. I'm not there yet. I'm going to get there. But I'm not there yet. And yet, despite the fact that I am not fully mature, that I am not fully arrived, nevertheless, Kadosh Baruch Hu conveys bracha to me. Why? Because Abba, father, always feels close to his child. And Abba just wants to give and give and give, even if the child is not yet deserving of it. Incredible. Amalei Shmuel Rav Chana ba'agadato. Puk aisi be'asara ve'im lecha payu. So let's listen to this. This is great. So Shmuel said to Rav Chana ba'agadato, do me a favor, go and gather 10 people, which means get a chevra together. I want to tell you something. Hamazakil uber kana. I want to make an announcement. The announcement is chevra, right? Shimon Rabosai, right? An uber is kona. The Gemara says vehilchasa. Hamazakil uber lo kana. All right, so we'll say, right? A little bit of a downer over here, right? So here, Rav Chana ba'agadato was getting all excited. I want to make a public announcement. An uber is kana. The Gemara says, by the way, an uber is not kana. As well, so we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up now again. I promise you, Allah Al-Maisa. I promise you, I have it. It's actually, we're going to see a Shulchan Aruch this time in Choshen Mishpat. We're going to be continued tomorrow. Shkayach, everyone. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day.